Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are continuing our series, 10 Great Economists, and following last week's exploration of Frank Taussig.
The pragmatic, level-headed American institutionalist.
Exactly. Today we are making a pretty radical pivot. We're moving from the professor who was focused on practical history and policy to an intellectual titan.
A Triton who dealt almost exclusively in the language of pure mathematics and rigorous systems.
We're talking about Irving Fisher.
We are. It's a necessary transition because Fisher, who lived from 1867 to 1947, he really represents the absolute zenith of technical brilliance in American economic thought.
A system builder.
A system builder, a mathematical pioneer, and the author of definitive works that are, they're still the foundation of how we discuss finance and monetary policy today.
Yet, right away, we're hit with this paradox. Joseph Schumpeter, whose essays are, the basis for our deep dive, he frames Fisher as one of the most complex figures.
And, in his estimation, one of the most tragic figures of the entire period.
That word tragic is impossible to ignore, especially when you consider the historical context.
Right. This was the man who, in the summer of 1929, famously declared that the stock market had reached a permanently high plateau.
Just before the Great Crash.
Just before the crash decimated global wealth. His entire intellectual life was defined by this tension, just immense analytical power paired with this crusading zeal that sometimes demanded a dangerous simplicity.
So that's our mission today, to really dig into Schumpeter's dual assessment of Fisher.
We have to honor Fisher, the rigorous scientist, the architect of modern interest theory, a pioneer of econometrics.
While at the same time analyzing Fisher, the enthusiastic public crusader. And we need to understand how the zeal of the reformer might have, compromised the scientific integrity of the brilliant theorist.
Let's start at the beginning then. We have to establish just how brilliant this man truly was.
Where do we see that first?
His brilliance was just. It was immediately evident from his very first major work. We're talking about his PhD thesis from Yale in 1892. It was titled Mathematical Investigations in the Theory of Value and Prices. And what makes this thesis so utterly astounding is the story of how it was created. Fisher was, by all accounts, an intellectual force of nature.
So you're not just talking about, good grades or academic achievement. This is something else.
It's a different level entirely. It's almost a kind of independent, spontaneous intellectual discovery. Schumpeter makes this point emphatically.
How so?
In 1890, while he was putting this thesis together, Fisher independently derived the core equations that describe general equilibrium.
General equilibrium. So the big intellectual architecture for how all markets in an entire economy interact and settle.
The very same, the framework that's essential to all modern macroeconomics.
Wait a second. General equilibrium, that's almost always associated with the great European economist, Leon Walras.
It is, and Walras published his definitive system much, much earlier. But here is the key point.
Okay.
At the time Fisher derived his equations, he had read precisely one mathematical economist, William Stanley Jevons.
And Walras.
He had read none of Walras's work. He achieved this fundamental discovery of the Walrasian system in near total intellectual isolation from what was happening in Europe.
That is just an astonishing feat.
It is.
It suggests his mind wasn't just capable of learning what others had built, but of creating the architecture of the system from scratch.
Precisely. It confirms his exceptional intellectual stature. He wasn't just translating existing ideas into math. He was operating at the absolute summit of theoretical capacity, generating these deep economic principles using pure logic.
And this immediately put him right at the frontier of how we model human behavior and choice.
Yes, he is absolutely considered the ancestor of the logic of choice. His investigations were pioneering not just in their scope, but in addressing these highly specialized, very advanced theoretical issues.
Like what?
Well, for instance, take his work on the subtle mathematical point known as the question of integrability.
Okay, stop right there. Integrability sounds like one of those technical terms that's guaranteed to make our listeners' eyes glaze over. What does that mean in human terms, and why should we care about this kind of detail?
That's a fair challenge. Think of it this way. In economics, we assume you have preferences. You prefer coffee over tea, for example.
Sure.
We use math to map these preferences onto something called a utility function. Imagine a topographical map showing hills of happiness.
Okay, I'm with you.
Integrability asks a simple question. Is your journey up that preference hill consistent? If you prefer A over B and B over C, do you necessarily prefer A over C?
The transitive property from math class.
Essentially, yes. If your preferences are consistent, meaning the little steps you take between goods add up predictably to a total level of satisfaction, then your mathematical utility function is integrable.
If it's not.
If it's not integrable, it means your choices are chaotic, inconsistent, and mathematically impossible to model reliably. Fisher tackled this incredibly complex issue, which later became crucial to discussions by figures like Vilfredo Pareto.
So he was grappling with the very foundations, trying to prove that consistent choice, and therefore a stable economic equilibrium, was even mathematically possible.
Exactly. He was working to prove that economic modeling works. But this brings us to the central irony of his early career.
Which is?
He helped build this rigorous mathematical apparatus that later led economists to realize that we don't need to measure your internal psychological satisfaction, your utility, to model your choices.
Right, revealed preference theory. Actions speak louder than feelings.
Exactly. Yet he simultaneously devoted huge energy to a method of measuring that very thing.
The great contradiction.
It is. Part one of his thesis points toward revealed preference, the idea that observed choices are enough. But then part two moves right back toward measuring the subjective feeling of utility. He actually proposed to define a unit of utility. The util.
And how in the world do you put a number on happiness?
Well, it wasn't arbitrary, but it required a huge, very specific simplification of reality.
I can imagine.
Fisher proposed that the measurement of these utils was only possible under the crucial restriction that the utility of any one commodity depends only on its own quantity.
So it's completely independent of the quantities of other commodities.
Perfect.
So if I buy coffee, the satisfaction I get from that coffee is entirely separate from whether or not I also buy cream or sugar to go with it.
Precisely. That is the independence assumption. In the real world, of course, goods are complements or substitutes. The utility of having one ski is almost zero, right?
Right.
But the utility of the second ski suddenly jumps. Fisher's system had to ignore all of those relationships.
That seems like an almost fatal flaw for modeling the real world. So why did Schumpeter call this effort one of the greatest performances of nascent econometrics?
Because it was the first serious attempt to make the purely abstract concept of utility quantifiable, even if the constraints were totally unrealistic.
So it was the attempt itself that mattered.
It was a pioneering step in translating theory into a structure that could eventually be tested with data. It laid the groundwork for modern quantitative research and figures like Ragnar Frisch, who was obsessed with measurement.
So Fisher showed the possibility of translating these abstract theoretical variables into measurable data points.
Right.
He was pushing economics far beyond just verbal arguments.
He was prioritizing methodological progress, and he took that same systematic, rigorous approach, that commitment to...
It's like building a beautiful cathedral, but then realizing your foundation stones are all different sizes and you've been calling them by the wrong names.
That is a perfect analogy. Fisher argued that for rigorous analysis, you need a semantic code, a consistent schema of economic accounting. He was basically providing the definitive glossary for economics.
And other economists recognize this.
Oh, absolutely. It's why Vilfredo Pareto, a giant of theoretical economics, admired the work so greatly. It brought much-needed clarity to that messy interface between pure theory and messy reality.
So what was the conceptual core that he established? What was the big idea?
Fisher systematically derived rational definitions for wealth, property, services, capital, and income. His lasting legacy here is the foundational emphasis on distinguishing economic concepts as either funds and flows.
Funds and flows. This is
Yes.
taught in every intro finance and econ class now, but Fisher was the one who codified it.
He was. A fund is a stock, right?
Yeah.
It's measured at a single moment in time, like the value of your house right now, or the total national wealth on January 1st.
And a flow.
A flow is measured over a period of time, like your monthly salary or national production over a full year. Capital is a fund, and income is a flow that's derived from that capital. This one distinction eliminated massive confusion in the economic debates of his time.
And this purely analytical distinction, something designed just for theoretical consistency, it ended up having radical and, well, revolutionary implications when applied to real-world policy.
Specifically taxation.
Right. This is where Fisher's intellectual rigor forces a direct confrontation with existing law.
Absolutely. Based on his funds and flows distinction, he developed a precise, analytically derived definition of earned income. He defined it as earned income equals realized income less depreciation or plus appreciation of capital.
Okay, so far that sounds pretty standard for modern business accounting. Where does the radical policy twist come in?
The twist is what happens to your savings. When you earn income, it's a flow. When you save that income, you convert that flow into a fund, into capital. And if that capital is invested, it will then generate a future income, which is another flow. Fisher's framework dictates that savings must be excluded from income taxation.
Why? Why must they be excluded?
Because if you tax the initial income when it's earned, and then you tax the returns generated by the capital fund that the savings became, you are taxing the same economic value twice.
Once in its flow state and once in its fund state.
He argued it was simply double taxation.
That's fascinating. So his pursuit of just analytical purity, making sure his equations were internally consistent, led him to a conclusion that basically undermines the entire structure of the modern American income tax system.
It absolutely does. Our system generally taxes income regardless of whether you save it or you consume it.
So it forces the question, if this schema is the analytically correct one, shouldn't our tax system reflect it?
And this isn't just some historical curiosity. Fisher's framework is the intellectual progenitor of modern arguments for consumption taxes like a value-added tax, a VAT, or proposals like the Hall-Rabushka flat tax.
All of which seek to exempt savings to avoid this exact double taxation problem.
Right. It's the ultimate example of how purely abstract theory can lead to these really revolutionary policy demands.
That connection is key. It shows that Fisher wasn't just working in some ivory tower. His logical purity had massive disruptive policy implications, whether he intended them or not.
Mm-hmm.
And this brings us to what Schumpeter calls his crowning theoretical achievement, the definitive explanation of interest.
Indeed. We now turn to The Rate of Interest from 1907, which he later revised into the seminal work The Theory of Interest in 1930.
And Schumpeter calls this the peak achievement of the literature of interest for its time.
He does, and the whole theory rests on the principle of time preference, a concept that was championed earlier by economists like Eugen von Boom-Bawerk and Jevons.
Time preference. So the idea that we value things now more than we value them in the future.
It's simply the idea that there is a difference in value between present and future commodities. We value present enjoyment or present command over resources more highly than future command. It's the psychological fact of impatience.
So Fisher took that concept and built the rigorous mathematical structure that explained how that impatience translates into the market rate of interest.
Exactly. He didn't invent time preference, but he built the system that made it analytically dominant. And his core thesis redefined the entire scope of interest theory.
How so?
He argued that interest is not some separate branch of distribution like wages for labor or rent for land. He said it is only an aspect of all income streams.
What does that mean for the average person who only thinks of interest when they take out a loan or, open a savings account?
It means that the force driving interest, our collective time preference, it penetrates every single valuation decision you make.
Every single one.
Everyone. If you decide to renovate your kitchen now versus next year, if a corporation decides to build a new factory today versus delaying it, all of these decisions are governed by a discounting process. Interest, Fisher showed, is merely the mathematical expression of that time preference.
So it applies logically to all capital, not just financial or industrial capital.
Exactly. That's a powerful generalization. It moves interest from being just a specialized financial phenomenon to being a universal economic constant.
The crucial methodological step forward.
It was. Economists before him, like Alfred Marshall, they often discussed land returns separately using concepts like quasi-rent. Fisher, along with other thinkers like F.A. Fetter, rigorously showed that the net return on capital is fundamentally unified.
It's all the same thing at its core.
It is not at all. He reinforced that commitment in the 1930 revision. He broke significant new ground, like in his Chapter 16, Relation of Discovery and Invention to Interest Rates.
What did he do there?
He integrated the effects of technological change and entrepreneurial discovery directly into the determination of the interest rate.
That seems incredibly sophisticated, tying innovation dynamics directly to financial pricing.
It was. And then in Chapter 19, he presents original statistical work trying to find real-world data to back up his theoretical constructs, which was incredibly difficult to do at the time.
A commitment to both abstract logic and statistical rigor.
That's what makes his work definitive.
So we've established Fisher as this systematic, indispensable technical architect of modern economic thought. Now, let's pivot to the crucial conflict.
Fisher the Crusader.
Yes, particularly in the realm of monetary policy. where his zeal started to undermine his own scientific caution.
This is where we fully enter that tragic dimension Schumpeter talks about. We're connecting the rigorous scientist to the man who made one of history's most ill-timed predictions.
Okay.
So Fisher, recognizing the centrality of stable money, dedicated his 1911 work, The Purchasing Power of Money, to monetary theory.
And I'm guessing this book was another pioneer in quantitative analysis.
A giant step forward. It was yet another great pioneer venture in econometrics. Fisher's primary goal was methodological. He wanted to ensure that every concept and every proposition was amenable to statistical measurement.
He was determined to make monetary theory an applied science.
Entirely.
What were the quantitative breakthroughs in the book?
There were several, mainly in data construction. His index number work was absolutely cutting edge, setting standards for how to measure price changes. He developed a rigorous index of the volume of trade.
But the real contribution was something else, right?
The most ingenious contribution was his pioneering method of estimating the velocity of money.
How quickly money changes hands in the economy.
Right. And velocity, V, is notoriously difficult to measure, isn't it? It's entirely behavioral.
How do you measure the speed of transactions?
Well, Fisher came up with an indirect method based on aggregate bank clearings and other transaction data. It was imperfect, sure, but it was the first serious attempt to put a number on this crucial variable.
Which made the quantity theory of money empirically testable.
Exactly. And at the heart of the book is that famous equation of exchange, MV equals PT.
Let's break that down thoroughly for the listener.
Okay. The equation is deceptively simple, but incredibly powerful. It states that the total amount of money spent on transactions must equal the total value of those transactions.
So M is the money supply.
Right, the physical currency, and crucially, bank deposits. Fisher included bank money, M prime.
V is velocity, the average number of times each dollar is spent over a period.
And on the other side of the equation, P is the general price level.
And T is the total volume of trade, or the number of goods and services exchanged.
Yeah.
So the core implication is, if you increase the amount of money, M, without increasing the volume of trade, T, then something else has to rise, and that's usually the price level, P.
That is the core implication of the quantity theory, assuming V and T are relatively stable in the short run. It's a mechanistic view. Money acts on prices predictably. And Fisher applied this equation year by year to historical data.
But this is where Schumpeter says the rigorous scientist started to compromise his own findings.
Absolutely. The quantity theory is only strictly true as a long-run equilibrium proposition. Think Marshallian economics. Over a long enough time frame, the economy settles and the amount of money dictates the price level.
But Fisher was applying it to annual data.
Right, even though his own analysis of transition periods, the short-run chaos where velocity changes and expectations shift, suggested that the theory was not strictly true during those dynamic phases.
So why? Why would the man who independently discovered general equilibrium, a man obsessed with precision, ignore the nuances of short-run dynamics and treat the quantity theory so mechanistically?
This is the definitive consequence of this scholar misled by the Crusader. Fisher was deeply impacted by the price instability of his time, and he became an evangelist for specific, radical monetary reforms. He felt a moral obligation to fix the economy.
And what were these famous or infamous reforms he staked his reputation on?
He had three major plans, all designed to stabilize the purchasing power of the dollar, which he saw as the ultimate economic evil. First, and most famous, was the compensated dollar.
The compensated dollar, what was it?
It was an attempt to keep the purchasing power of the dollar constant by adjusting its gold content. So if prices rose inflation, Fisher proposed that the government would slightly increase the gold weight of the dollar.
Making it harder to get, thus reducing M and bringing prices back down?
Exactly. And if prices fell deflation, they would slightly decrease the gold weight. The idea was to create an index-linked currency that was automatically self-correcting.
That sounds incredibly complex to manage politically. You need constant, public, and potentially destabilizing adjustments to the gold backing.
It was revolutionary, and the financial community was highly suspicious of it. But it was based on that core belief. If you can control M, the money supply, you can mechanically control P, the price level.
Okay, what was his second proposal?
His second, which came later during the Depression, was stamped money.
Stamped money. Like currency you have to get validated every so often.
Precisely. This was an attempt to force up the velocity, V, of money during a deflationary depression when everyone was hoarding cash.
How would it work?
The idea was that currency would have an expiration date unless a small tax stamp was purchased and affixed to it periodically, say, every single week.
Yeah.
If you didn't spend the money, you literally watched its value decay because you had to keep paying the stamp tax.
That is an astonishingly radical intervention into personal behavior.
It was designed to force spending and circulation to boost V and counteract deflation. And his final major proposal was 100% money, or 100% reserve banking.
This one sounds a bit closer to modern banking debates.
It is. Fisher was one of the earliest and most forceful advocates for forcing commercial banks to hold 100% reserves against their demand deposits.
And the goal there?
To eliminate the fractional reserve system, which would give the central authority, the Fed, total direct control over the money supply, M, if banks couldn't create new money through lending, M would become a perfectly controllable variable.
So if the Crusaders' goal was to push these radical, simple, and controllable solutions, like the compensated dollar or 100% reserves,
Then he needed a simple, scientifically endorsed base to convince what he called a recalcitrant humanity.
that's Schumpeter's insight. The urgency of the reforms forced Fisher to adopt a simplified, mechanistic version of the quantity theory.
He needed to be able to tell the public, look, if we stabilize M, we stabilize P. It's a direct mechanical link. He spoiled his work, Schumpeter argues, because the need for that evangelical simplicity clashed with the richness and complexity of his own theoretical work on short-run dynamics.
The Crusaders simplified the scientists' findings to make the policy palatable.
Yes, and this pattern, this trade-off between complex truth and simple advocacy, it repeated itself when he tackled the most complex problem of all, business cycles.
Especially in the wake of the 1929 disaster.
Absolutely. His work on economic dynamics, like booms and depressions, which he wrote in 1932, right after the crash that humiliated him, is actually methodologically very sound.
Really?
Oh, yeah. His 1925 paper was one of the earliest to suggest an explicitly dynamic model, a true intellectual achievement. He had what Schumpeter called admirable intuition, and he listed many of the most important potential starters of cyclical movement, everything from technology shocks to changes in crops.
So scientifically, the groundwork for a rich, multifactorial model of economic cycles was clearly there in his work.
It was. But once again, the zeal for a simple, controllable solution took precedence. In his published work, he pushed a very simplified causal mechanism to the forefront.
And what was that?
He argued that over-indebtedness and the subsequent process of debt deflation were the root of almost all the evils.
The famous debt deflation model. It became hugely influential later on through people like Hyman Minsky.
It did, though Fisher's version was highly focused on finding a single monetary lever to pull. He reduced all those complex dynamics, all those starters he intuitively understood, to this one mechanically controllable surface phenomenon.
And the solution was therefore simple. Stop the debt deflation spiral.
Exactly. But by doing that, he relegated his own richer multi-causal insights to the background.
He buried his own best work.
Schumpeter lamented that to find the real scientific insights, that admirable list of cyclical starters, you had to scrap the facade of the debt deflation story and go look in a separate chapter where the insights were hidden away, almost mentioned incidentally.
So his focus was exclusively on finding this simple, predictable, and controllable mechanism that justified his monetary reforms.
It's a profound intellectual tragedy, really. His experience with the 1929 plateau prediction was a public humiliation, and instead of retreating to the complexity of his pure theory, he doubled down on finding a simple, marketable solution.
Even if it meant simplifying his own analysis.
He even went so far as to deprecate the use of the term cycle for any actual historical event. He was suggesting his focus wasn't on the messy, irregular reality of historical booms and busts,
But rather on an idealized, controllable mechanism that could be instantly fixed.
he remained fundamentally a mechanistic thinker, seeking clear levers and simple equations.
So what does this all mean for his legacy? Fisher achieved immortality through his abstract structures, general equilibrium, the theory of income, the definitive explanation of interest.
But his policy zeal drove him towards simplifications that often detracted from his scientific value.
It means we owe him the architecture of modern quantitative economics, but we also receive a powerful cautionary tale.
His legacy forces us to confront that inherent tension for any public scholar. How do you simplify complex truth for public consumption without sacrificing its essential integrity? Fisher's life suggests that the price of the crusade can be the dulling of one's own scientific edge.
That is the enduring challenge presented by the brilliant and complex legacy of Irving Fisher. And we explored how his theoretical purity, especially regarding capital and income, led to those radical conclusions about taxation.
The concept of double taxation on savings.
Right. So let me pose this to you, the listener. If you accept Fisher's rational schema that savings should logically be excluded from taxation to maintain analytical consistency and economic fairness, what do you do with that?
Would you, in the face of all the political difficulty and public resistance that Fisher experienced, advocate for overturning the deeply entrenched income tax laws that govern most modern economies?
And furthermore, in deciding whether to pursue that analytically pure policy, would you heed the warning inherent in Fisher's own biography? The warning that the path from logical perfection to practical political application is inevitably fraught with simplification.
And the risk of compromising the complex truth. Is the pursuit of scientific purity always worth the risk of being misled by the zeal required to make that purity a reality?
That decision, that trade-off between perfect logic and political expediency, is the final challenge Fisher leaves us with.
A fascinating and complex figure indeed.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Irving Fisher. We'll see you next time.